Foreign Policy Fundamentals, International Systems and Levels of Analysis. International systems. Scholars of international politics often stress the importance of the international system, a term that refers to the overall patterns of behavior among sovereign states. Quick pause, states here doesn't refer to like our states in the country. States is another word for countries, for nations. So wherever they say states, we're talking about different countries in the world. States are countries. Just as the planets in our solar system rotate on their axes in predictable rhythms and orbit in predictable patterns, so states, again, foreign countries, can display predictable patterns of behavior vis-a-vis each other that are characteristic of a system. Systems transcend their individual parts and produce outcomes that reflect the contribution of their individual units. Take the human digestive system, for example. In different ways, the mouth, esophagus, stomach, small and large intestines, liver, and so on, each contributes to the body's ability to utilize the energy contained in food. But no single organ of the digestive system can accomplish this alone. It is the system itself that ultimately produces this health-benefiting outcome. Systems also can influence their individual parts. Gravitational forces within the solar system keep the planets aligned and prevent their orbits from producing planetary collisions. Just like the digestive or solar systems, the international political system can influence its members, the states. For example, in 1794, the United States was forced to sign the humiliating Jay Treaty with Britain, then at war with France, that granted Britain many concessions, but kept the United States out of the conflict between its former motherland and revolutionary ally. When President George Washington finished his second term in 1796, he established America's foreign policy of isolationism. Thomas Jefferson picked up the isolationist policy in 1803, and Secretary of State John Quincy Adams reiterated in 1821. The United States, Adams explained, had, without a single exception, respected the independence of other nations while asserting and maintaining her own, and had abstained from interference in the concerns of others. 2 years later, the 1823 Monroe Doctrine reaffirmed U.S. isolationism as official state policy. Yet, despite its leaders' intentions, despite its geography and the oceans that kept it isolated, the United States soon discovered that it was not an isolated entity at all, but rather was part of a larger international system. This system, in turn, began to affect how the United States government behaved. By 1848, just 25 years after announcing the Monroe Doctrine, the United States had gone outside its borders, made war with Mexico, and acquired half of Mexico's national territory in the process. Then, in 1898, the United States went to war with Spain over an issue the Spanish crown considered an internal matter, how to deal with an insurrection in its colony Cuba. As a result of this war, the United States acquired non-continental territories from Spain that stretched from the Caribbean to Asia, just like Britain, France, and other imperial powers possessed. These examples illustrate that despite its early intentions to remain isolationist, in time, the United States began to behave like other states did. A major factor behind this development was the United States' inclusion within a larger system of sovereign states, where states competed, strove to survive, and were compelled to look out for themselves. Political scientists focus on the international system because the more we understand its characteristics, the better positioned we are to explain why states act the way they do or adopt specific types of foreign policy. As we have seen, the international system's fundamental characteristic is anarchy, which diffuses power among the various states rather than concentrating in a higher common ruler above them. By studying the dispersal of power among states, we can hypothesize how they might behave, given their power levels, proximity, and relations to each other. We might predict, for example, that when one state feels threatened by another, there is a high probability it will act on its sense of insecurity and take measures to protect itself. A weak state might build up its own defenses for self-protection, seek the aid of a stronger state, or search for safety in isolationism. A stronger state might contemplate war against the state that threatens it. There are many examples of such behavior. In 1904, for example, Venezuela defaulted on its international debts it owed to Britain and Germany, then faced the prospects of a joint British-German naval bombardment to compel repayment. Completely outgunned, the Venezuelan state sought protection by asking the United States to mediate the dispute and stave off a naval assault. In the late 18th century, the United States was a small, weak country clustered along the eastern North American seaboard, surrounded and threatened by more powerful predatory states. Britain in the north and the south, Canada and the Caribbean, France to the south, the Caribbean, and Spain to the south and west, Florida, Louisiana, and the Caribbean. The Midwest, Arizona, California, Mexico, Texas, Utah. In this context, the United States chose to become isolationist. However, as U.S. power increased, America's response to threats changed accordingly. When the United States again felt threatened in the 19th century by French designs to acquire and rule Mexico through a puppet emperor, Ferdinand Maximilian, Washington protested and pressured Paris to withdraw. Eventually, it deployed 50,000 troops to the Rio Grande in a show of force. Now, Mexican forces ultimately executed Maximilian without U.S. direct intervention. The United States took these actions not because it was overly belligerent, but rather because it perceived a threat from the encroachment of a strong power next door. These examples illustrate how the dispersal of power within an anarchical international system can affect states' behavior. When the balance of power seems tilted against them, we can expect most to respond with steps to protect their security. Levels of analysis. One way to gain even more leverage on states' behavior and the dynamics of hemispheric relations is to employ a different set of analytic tools. Most textbooks on international relations devote some time to discussing levels of analysis, drawing on the work of political scientists such as J. David Singer and Kenneth Waltz. Scholars use these levels of analysis to understand policy output and the factors that motivate states' behavior. The first level analysis is that of the individual. Here the focus is on the actions of specific individuals, their skills and weaknesses, personality traits, and beliefs and ambitions. These are actual people. What we seek at the first level is to assess how individual people might affect the course of events or influence foreign policy output. The first level encompasses not only individual state leaders, it also includes those who might advise a national leader or exercise significant influence in shaping policy preferences and goals from outside the government, for example, in banking, business, or journalism. How did Mexico's president Carlos Salinas de Gortari influence the creation of the North American Free Trade Agreement between Mexico, the United States, and Canada? Was President James Monroe a more important individual force behind the Monroe Doctrine, or did others play important roles as well? Did President William McKinley really matter to the outbreak of the Spanish-American War, or did his Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Theodore Roosevelt, carry more weight? Was Fidel Castro the driving force behind the U.S.-Cuban estrangement? Different people might answer these questions in different ways, as we shall see. However, caution is warranted. It is hard to explain international politics completely if we only consider individuals. By default, international politics entails interactions between separate states, and by focusing only on what any one individual did, we may overlook other factors that affect individual actions to begin with. Take the case of U.S. isolationism. By focusing only on Washington or Adams's intentions to keep the U.S. as an isolated power, we may not notice how the anarchical international system influenced America to embrace policies similar to those of other states. Yet it remains the case that sometimes individuals do matter. Washington made a significant contribution to the course of U.S. foreign policy. The fact that Monroe and McKinley selected Adams and Roosevelt for positions of authority had real consequences for the Monroe Doctrine and the Spanish-American War. Roosevelt's personality in particular was critical in charting the U.S.'s path towards war and the expansionist policy it followed thereafter. However, neither the doctrine nor the war can be explained solely on a individual basis. And while Castro had the final say on Cuba's foreign policy, the Cuban-U.S. standoff itself had many roots. Individuals do not act in a vacuum, and major events between states have multiple causes. While the first level of analysis can be useful, it rarely tells us all we need to know about the state's foreign policy. Other causal factors can be found in the domestic setting in which national leaders operate, the domestic setting, or the second level of analysis. Like individuals, states have distinct characteristics that can influence their policy choice and political outcomes. Is the state's political regime democratic or authoritarian? Is its economic system capitalist or socialist? Is its economy large or small, industrial or agrarian? What about its ideology? Does it embrace liberal democracy, communism, economic nationalism, Islamic fundamentalism, or some other ism? Understanding the fundamental characteristics of states or societies can shed light on the forces that shape a state's perception of its interest and help drive its foreign policy. If a state's political regime is democratic, for example, then factors such as public opinion or democratic pressure groups can influence its foreign policy or constrain its leaders, more than if the regime were authoritarian. Under a capitalist economic system, certain groups or economic sectors will likely have greater influence with government leaders and can translate their preferences into state policy more easily at certain times or in certain issue areas. If the ideology that animates the state is expansionist, communist or manifest destiny, for example, this can influence how the state perceives its interests and the type of policies it crafts to pursue and protect. Ideologies are sets of ideas that offer a comprehensive vision or normative worldview of what society or the world should look like and are based on assumptions that typically go largely unexamined. Two assumptions central to communist ideology, for example, are a belief that the inevitable overthrow of the capitalist class and the inherent enmity between capitalists and communist systems. On this basis, we should expect states that have communist ideologies to fear or be hostile to their capitalist counterparts, and to support political movements that seek to overthrow capitalism. Cuba's foreign policy in the 1960s, which endeavored to export revolutions to Venezuela, Panama, and Guatemala, illustrates this dynamic. Another example would be the U.S. ideology of manifest destiny. Among its assumptions were that America's society and political system were exceptional and uniquely virtuous compared to others, that its racial stock, Anglo-Saxon, was naturally superior to other ethnic groups, and that it was divinely predestined to increase its stature, prestige, and territory. In the mid-1800s, this expansionist ideology helped justify U.S. aggression against Mexico during the Mexican-American War, which cost Mexico roughly half its territory. A third example is the United States' domestic democratic ideology, which emphasizes core values like individual liberty, self-determination. When America first announced the Monroe Doctrine in 1823 and at various times thereafter, U.S. policy towards Latin America did reflect a desire to extend and preserve such democratic principles. We're going to skip box 3.1 because we will talk about that in a few other chapters. So if you want to skip ahead to page 53. Under the map there. Still, we must take care how we use domestic second-level analysis. As we shall discover, despite its democratic ideology, over time, U.S. leaders reinterpreted the Monroe Doctrine in ways that actually worked against self-determination for Latin American states, anti-democratic. Mexico, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and other states in the Caribbean and Central America all bore the brunt of this development. Moreover, the United States adopted confrontational policies against some governments in Latin America that had been elected democratically, and whose tenure in power was an expression of self-determination by the voters. Chile and Guatemala come to mind. These outcomes suggest that while the nature of a given state or society can tell us much about how that state might act, it's not always an accurate predictor. Factors beyond individual and domestic levels influence the state's political calculations too, and thus their foreign policies and interactions with other states. So we got individual people in the states themselves, the cultural, domestic issues, and now, thirdly, the international system constitutes the third level of analysis and reflects the mirror opposite of the second. Whereas the latter explains outcomes by way of the state's internal features, the former does so by its way of external settings. One question we might ask here is how the incentives and constraints the anarchic international system generates might affect the behavior of individual states. How does the outside system affect the individual state's behavior? Perhaps the most important incentive that emanates from the international system is a powerful self-help motivation. One of the system's most important constraints is the way the balance of power in the system affects state actions. Each is consequential. As we study U.S.-Latin American relations, we will discover compelling explanations of state behavior often involve interplay between the various levels, but we should not assume that all three levels are always of equivalent weight. It is not simply the case that everything matters. Sometimes domestic, level 2 factors may carry more weight than the international, level 3 factors. Sometimes it may be the reverse, and sometimes individual factors rise to the fore in combination with the other two. Our task in studying the dynamics and U.S.-Latin American relations is to use levels of analysis in conjunction with other analytical tools and theories to construct persuasive causal explanations of international politics in the Western Hemisphere. A good causal explanation may be complex, but should also be parsimonious. That is, it should stress the most significant causal factors while weeding out the unnecessary details. Systemic third-level explanations typically are quite parsimonious because they have the fewest moving parts. They may not, however, sufficiently address the complex issue we hope to explain. When we encounter such complexity, therefore, a wise approach is to begin with the third level, then move to the second, and then the first, until step by step we construct a tight, comprehensive explanation of a particular case. So in AP, we're going to look at things that happen, especially with foreign relations. Then we're going to start with what's going on in the world, the international system, level 3. Then we're going to say, okay, what's the culture and the ideology, level 2 of the domestic setting? And then finally, who are the individual people at play? What role did they play into this? And as this author is explaining, sometimes one may be more significant than the other, and you guys will make that call. But it's this level of complexity and layers that we're really going to strive for in AP. So good luck, and we'll talk about it in class.